The galactic conclave was the most important room in the known universe. That was not an opinion. That was simply a fact that every species accepted without question. It sat at the center of Conclave Station, a structure so large that it had its own gravity systems, its own weather patterns in certain sections, and its own internal transit lines that ran for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. The main chamber alone could hold 10,000 delegates from 212 member species. The ceiling was so high that the upper observation galleries looked like tiny dots from the floor. Light came from artificial suns embedded in the walls, shifting color and warmth to suit the biological needs of whatever species happened to be speaking at the time. It was, by any measure, an impressive place. Delegate Serena Voss had never been impressed by it. She sat at the human delegation table on the main floor, a small rectangular platform among hundreds of others, each one marked with the sigil of its respective species. The human table was near the back. That was not an accident. Earth had been a probationary member of the conclave for 60 years, and probationary members did not get front-row seats. They sat in the back, they spoke when spoken to, and they were reminded frequently, through policy, through protocol, and sometimes through outright rudeness, that they were guests in a galaxy that had been organized long before they arrived. Serena was 44 years old. She had dark eyes that moved slowly and deliberately over a room, the kind of eyes that seemed to be reading something most people couldn't see. She wore the standard blue formal uniform of the Earth Diplomatic Corps, pressed flat, no decorations except for the small golden pin of the UN emblem on her left collar. She had a datapad in front of her, a glass of water she hadn't touched, and a stillness about her that some delegates found calming and others found deeply unsettling. Today, the chamber was at full capacity. That was unusual. Most conclave sessions drew maybe a third of the member delegates. Full sessions happened only when something large was on the agenda. Today, something large was on the agenda. The Vreth Dominion had called the session. That alone told experienced delegates everything they needed to know about the mood of the room. The Vreth were not a species known for patience or subtlety. They were large, physically imposing beings, with gray-plated skin, 4 arms, and a posture that always seemed to suggest they were about to either negotiate or attack, and were comfortable doing either. Their dominion controlled 47 star systems. Their military was the 3rd largest in the known galaxy. They had started 6 wars in the last 200 years and won 5 of them. The 6th they had ended in a negotiated draw, which they considered a personal insult they had never fully gotten over. High Consul Draven stood at the central speaking platform. He was taller than most Vreth, which made him taller than almost anything else in the room. His plated armor was ceremonial but still thick enough to stop most standard weapons. He had small black eyes that moved with sharp, calculated intelligence, and a voice that the translation systems picked up easily because it carried through walls. He was talking about humanity. He had been talking about humanity for the last 20 minutes. The speech had started formally enough, a presentation of grievances, a list of policy violations, a claim that Earth's outer colonies were expanding into territory the Vreth Dominion considered part of its natural sphere of influence. But it had shifted in tone about 10 minutes in. It had become something else, something uglier. High Consul Draven was no longer making a legal argument. He was making a performance. He was mocking them. He called Earth a young species playing at adulthood. He called humanity's FTL fleet a collection of old boats. He referred to Earth's military as a trained guard dog with no teeth. Laughter moved through sections of the chamber. Not from all species. Several sat quietly, expressionless, but from enough that the sound was clear and unmistakable. Serena sat still through all of it. She did not look angry. She did not look embarrassed. She looked like someone waiting for a bus. At the human table, her aide, a young man named Tomas, leaned slightly toward her and whispered, "Do you want to request the floor?" "Not yet," she said quietly. Draven continued. He moved from mockery to motion. He formally proposed before the full conclave that Earth's 3 outer colonies reach station, the Meridian Outpost and New Carthage, be reclassified as unclaimed territories, stripped from human administration, and absorbed into the Vreth Dominion's governance zone. He proposed that Earth be reclassified from probationary member status to client species status, which in conclave terms meant something very close to a ward. A species that was managed rather than represented. He used calm, procedural language to say it, which somehow made it worse than the mockery had been. Earth has demonstrated, Draven said, his voice smooth and even, that it lacks the capacity, the resources, and frankly the maturity to manage independent colonial holdings at this stage of its development. The Vreth Dominion is prepared to offer a managed transition. It is a generous offer. I would encourage the human delegation to receive it in the spirit in which it is intended. More quiet laughter. A few species shifted in their seats, not laughing but not objecting either. Tomas typed something on his pad, pulling up the procedural response options. His hands were moving fast. We can request an emergency recess. We can file a counter-motion. We can request arbitration under Article. Tomas, Serena said. He stopped typing. Yes. Give me the floor. She stood. She pressed the request button on the table panel and the system acknowledged her immediately, lighting the human table's indicator in white. The conclave chair, a 4-armed Delian named Presiding Voice Amara, recognized her with a nod. The floor recognizes Delegate Voss of Earth. Serena walked to the central platform. She did not rush. Draven stepped aside with a small, almost theatrical bow, gesturing the platform over to her as though offering something small and inconsequential. She stepped up. The platform adjusted to human height. She looked out at the 10,000 delegates for a long moment. The room was quiet. Then she looked directly at Draven. High Consul, she said. Her voice was calm and even and perfectly clear through every translator in the room. I have listened carefully to your proposal. I would like to respond to it. Draven spread 2 of his 4 arms in an open gesture. By all means. Serena set her datapad down on the edge of the platform. She did not look at it again. For 60 years, she said, humanity has been a member of this conclave. In that time we have followed every rule. We have paid every fee. We have shown up to every session, filed every report, and accepted every limitation placed on us as a probationary species without complaint. She paused. We have also been watching. A few delegates shifted. Draven's expression did not change. We have watched how this body works, she continued. We have watched which species get heard and which ones don't. We have watched how power moves in this room. We have watched conflicts start and end. We have studied every war filed in this conclave's records, every military engagement, every tactical decision made by every major power in this galaxy over the last 2 centuries. She stopped again. The room was very quiet now. We are quick learners. Draven made a small sound that translated roughly as polite impatience. This is a charming speech, delegate, but... I am not finished, Serena said, not loudly, not rudely, simply as a statement of fact. Draven stopped. Serena turned slightly, addressing the broader chamber now. The High Consul has proposed that humanity be reclassified as a client species, that our colonies be taken, that we be placed under the management of a government we did not choose. I want to be very clear about our position on this proposal. She paused one more time. When she spoke again, her voice was exactly the same, quiet, even unhurried. You do not want us to stop holding ourselves back. 12 words. They landed in the chamber and stayed there. Then the laughter started. It began at the Vreth table and spread outward like a wave. It was not cruel laughter exactly. It was the laughter of people who found something genuinely absurd. The idea of humanity, small, young, technologically middling humanity, issuing what sounded like a warning to the galactic conclave was, by most standards in that room, objectively funny. A threat, Draven said, and now he was smiling, which on a breath looked like a lot of teeth. The human delegate is threatening the conclave. I am informing the conclave, Serena said. More laughter. Delegates from the Surak hegemony were speaking to each other, not bothering to lower their voices. The myriad clan's representative was shaking what served as his head. Even some of the quieter species in the upper galleries seemed to be exchanging glances of amused disbelief. Serena stood at the platform and said nothing more. She waited for the laughter to die down the way a person waits for rain to pass, patient, unbothered. When the noise settled, she stepped down from the platform, picked up her datapad and walked back to the human table. She sat down. She picked up her glass of water and finally took a sip. Tomas stared at her. That's it, that's our response. That's our response, she said. They're going to pass the motion. Yes, she said, they are. He stared at her for another moment, then turned back to his pad, looking deeply uncertain. The chamber had returned to its procedural business. Draven's motion was formally entered for a vote. The debate portion was brief. Very few species wanted to spend political capital defending humanity, and several who might have been inclined to object seemed to decide quietly that it wasn't worth the friction with the Vreth Dominion. The vote was called. 140 species voted in favor of the motion. 12 voted against. The rest abstained. Earth's outer colonies were, by formal conclave resolution, stripped of human administration. Earth was reclassified to client species status, pending compliance. A 30-day window was given for humanity to begin voluntary withdrawal from the named territories. It was, by any official measure, a complete diplomatic defeat. Serena watched the vote tallies appear on the display board above the chamber floor. She read each number carefully. Then she closed her datapad and began organizing her things. She was nearly ready to leave when she noticed something. 3 tables had not voted. Not for the motion, not against it, not abstaining. Their indicators simply sat dark. The conclave system had marked them as non-participatory, which was technically permitted but extremely rare. The first was the Earl Collective. The Earl were one of the oldest species in the conclave, a civilization so ancient that the records of their early history had been lost even to themselves. They communicated through a delegate who appeared to be a simple, unadorned figure in gray, and they almost never spoke unless the matter was of genuine galactic significance. They had not voted. The second was the Doan architects. The Doan were reclusive to an extreme, known primarily for structures they had built across dozens of star systems thousands of years ago, structures that no one else fully understood the purpose of. They rarely attended sessions in person. Their delegate was a projection. Today, the projection was present, and it had not voted. The third was the most unusual of all. The observers of the Rim were a species that had technically been conclave members for over 600 years but had not spoken on the floor in 400. They sent a representative. The representative sat. They observed. They never voted, never spoke. It was simply their way, and the conclave had long since stopped expecting anything else from them. Today, after the vote had been recorded, the observer delegate's indicator light activated. A request for the floor. The presiding voice looked at it for a moment as if she wasn't sure she was reading it correctly. Then she granted it. The observer delegate rose. It was a slender being, wrapped entirely in dark fabric from head to foot, the way the observers always appeared in public. Its voice was dry and quiet and very old-sounding. We do not make a habit of speaking on matters of galactic politics, it said. We find that events generally follow their own course regardless of what is said in rooms like this one. A pause. However, we would be failing in a responsibility of basic honesty if we sat silent today. Another pause, longer this time. Heed her. 2 words. Then the observer sat back down and the indicator light went dark. The chamber was quiet for a few seconds. Then the murmur started again, and within a minute the room had mostly moved on, treating it as a strange footnote. The observers occasionally did strange things. This would be added to the list. Tomas was watching Serena with an expression that mixed worry with something approaching awe. The observers spoke, he said quietly. I noticed, she said. When did they last speak on the floor? 400 years ago, she said. They warned the conclave that the Cirque expansion would end in catastrophe. The conclave didn't listen. The Cirque expansion ended in catastrophe. Tomas was quiet for a moment. Should I be scared? Serena looked at him. There was something in her expression that was not quite a smile and not quite anything else. Tomas, she said, you work for Earth. You have nothing to be scared of. She stood, collected her bag, and walked toward the exit corridor. Around her, other delegations were filing out, talking among themselves, already moving on to other business. The session was over. The vote had been cast. Humanity had been given 30 days. No one paid much attention to the human delegate as she walked out. She was small and quiet, and her species had just been formally reduced in status in front of the entire galaxy. There was nothing particularly threatening about her. Nothing that suggested the situation was anything other than what it appeared to be. A small, young species being reminded of its place. Out in the corridor, Serena paused at a wide observation window that looked out into open space. The stars were very bright from out here, far from any sun. She stood there for a moment, looking at them. Behind her, she heard the faint sound of Vreth delegates laughing again about something as they passed. She did not turn around. She just looked at the stars. Then she took out her personal communicator and made a call. It connected in seconds, routed through 6 encrypted relays back to Earth. The voice that answered was deep and unhurried. How did it go? General Haruto Mace asked. As expected, she said. The vote passed 30 days. A pause and the warning. Delivered, she said. Another pause longer. They laughed. They laughed, she confirmed. The general was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite sadness. It was something in between, the feeling of a person who had prepared a very long time for something and was now watching it begin. Then it starts, he said. It starts, she agreed. She put the communicator away and looked out the window for one more moment. The stars looked back, indifferent and vast and full of things that were about to change. Then she turned and walked down the corridor, her footsteps quiet and even on the polished floor, and she did not look back. 30 days, the countdown had begun. And somewhere in the deep dark of the outer solar system, in places that appeared on no official map and no conclave registry, lights were coming on. Systems were waking up. Things that had been still for a very long time were beginning, slowly and deliberately, to move. The galaxy had been warned. It had chosen not to listen. That choice, like most choices made without enough information, was going to have consequences. The Keth Republic was not a large empire. It controlled 11 star systems, maintained a modest fleet, and had a long tradition of staying out of other species conflicts. What the Keth were known for, what they were genuinely good at, was information. Their media networks ran across 40 member species of the conclave. Their journalists were everywhere. Their investigative reporters had broken some of the most significant stories in galactic politics over the last 3 centuries. When the Keth press picked up a story, people paid attention. Journalist Vey Oren had been covering the conclave beat for 9 years. She was good at her job because she asked simple questions and refused to accept complicated non-answers. She had a stubborn streak that her editors loved when it produced results and hated when it got her into diplomatic trouble. She had 3 official warnings from the conclave press office in her file and considered them a mark of professional pride. When the conclave vote stripped Earth of its outer colonies, Vey filed a standard wrap-up piece on the session and moved on to her next story. That was on a Tuesday. By Thursday, she had a source. The source was anonymous. The message came through a secondary channel she used for tips, a channel that had given her good information twice before and nonsense 3 times. So she treated it with careful skepticism. The message said only, "Find out what they build at night." She almost dismissed it. It was cryptic in the way that bad tips usually were, dramatic sounding, light on detail. But something made her sit with it for a while. What they build at night. It was a strange phrase, specific enough to feel like it meant something, vague enough to be frustrating. She started pulling publicly available data on Earth. Infrastructure filings, construction reports, shipping manifests, anything that went through conclave registration systems. Humans were required, like all member species, to report major construction projects that exceeded certain thresholds. They had been reporting projects steadily for 6 decades. She started reading the reports, all of them. It took her 4 days. By the end of the 4th day, she had a headache and a feeling in her chest that she couldn't quite name. The reports were clean, perfect almost. Every project listed was described in clear civilian terms: mining infrastructure, energy relay stations, deep space research platforms, agricultural support satellites, communications hubs. It was a 60-year record of a species doing exactly what growing species did, building out their presence in the solar system and beyond. The numbers added up. The filings were consistent. Nothing flagged. Except, the scale was strange. She started cross-referencing the reported output figures. If the mining stations reported were actually producing what the filings said they were producing, the raw material numbers were significantly larger than what Earth's reported civilian construction could account for. Not by a little, by a lot. She ran the numbers 3 times, thinking she was making an error somewhere. She wasn't. Material was going somewhere that wasn't being reported. Or it was going somewhere that was being reported under a label that didn't reflect what it actually was. She made a call to an old source at a shipping data firm. He pulled manifests on Earth-flagged cargo vessels over the last 30 years and sent her the summary file. She looked at the routes. Some of them went to places that were listed in navigation registries as empty space, deep space coordinates with no registered installations. She checked those coordinates against conclave survey maps. The survey maps said nothing was there. She requested current position data from an independent sensor network she had access to through a press arrangement. It took 3 days to get results. When the results came in, 4 of those empty coordinates showed thermal readings consistent with large, active installations. Nothing was registered at those locations, but something was definitely there. She published a first piece, carefully worded, presenting the data gaps without drawing conclusions she couldn't yet support. It was a quiet piece, buried in the Conclave Affairs section of her outlet's feed. Most species passed over it. One species didn't. She received a call from a contact in the Vreth intelligence network 2 days after publication. He didn't give his name. He spoke fast. "You are looking at the surface," he said. "You should be looking at what your sensors can't see." "What do I use to look?" she asked. "Ask what happened to our operative," he said. Then the call cut off. She spent a week trying to find out what he meant. Eventually, through a chain of contacts in Vreth diplomatic circles, she learned something that had not been made public. The Vreth Dominion's intelligence division had embedded an operative on Earth roughly 10 years earlier, a long-term deep cover asset. The operative had filed routine reports for years. 3 weeks ago, the reports stopped. All contact was lost. A recovery team was dispatched and found no trace of the operative or her cover identity. Her last transmission had been partial, a garbled data burst that had only partially decoded. The fragment that was recovered contained sensor log data and 4 words. "They build at night." They sat with that for a long time. Then she published her second piece. This one was not buried. It ran across the front of every major feed in the Keth network and got picked up by 23 other outlets within 6 hours. The headline was simple: "Where is Earth's material going?" The response was significant. Dozens of species requested clarification from Earth's conclave delegation. The Earth delegation, through a spokesperson, issued a polite and thoroughly unrevealing statement saying that all construction activities had been reported in accordance with conclave regulations, and that they were happy to answer specific questions through official channels. No one asked specific questions through official channels, because no one was entirely sure yet what specific questions to ask. Meanwhile, in Geneva, deep below the main UN governmental complex, in a building that appeared on official maps as an administrative records facility, the UN War Council was having a meeting. The room was underground, 40 meters of reinforced material between the ceiling and the open air above. It seated 12 people around a hexagonal table. On the walls were displays showing system maps, fleet positions, construction status, and 100 other data streams. It was not a comfortable room. It was not designed to be comfortable. It was designed to make decisions. General Haruto Mace sat at the head of the table. He was 61 years old, with close-cropped gray hair and a face that showed the results of a life spent outdoors in difficult places. He had the kind of physical presence that had nothing to do with being loud. He was consistently quiet, and everything to do with the way he occupied space. When he was still, people noticed. When he moved, people paid attention. He had a coffee mug in front of him that he hadn't touched. Around the table sat the 11 other members of the War Council, military directors, intelligence chiefs, 3 of the highest-level engineers from the Strategic Construction Division. They had all received the same briefing summary this morning. They all had the same look on their faces, which was the look of people who had been working towards something for a long time and were now watching the moment they'd prepared for arrive. "The Keth journalist's second piece went wide this morning," said Director Chen, who ran the Strategic Intelligence branch. She was a small, precise woman who spoke in complete sentences and never used 2 words when one would do. 17 hours from publication, we have request flags from 41 conclave member species. 6 of them are major powers. "The Vreth?" Mace asked. "The Vreth are not flagging through official channels," Chen said. "They're doing their own quiet work, which means they're scared enough to not want to ask questions they might not like the answers to." Mace nodded slowly. "And the colonies?" "Reach station is fully dark as of 48 hours ago. To anyone doing a standard scan, it looks abandoned. The Meridian outpost has been reclassified under the construction registry cover. New Carthage is running the civilian standard protocol." She paused. "Everything is positioned." Mace was quiet for a moment. He picked up his coffee mug, looked into it, and set it down without drinking. "Let's do the briefing," he said. What followed over the next 4 hours was the most complete picture of Earth's real military capability that had ever been assembled in one room. Not because it hadn't existed before. It had in pieces, spread across 100 different security levels and administrative compartments. But today, by authorization of the War Council, it was being combined, assembled, shown as a whole. It had started 80 years ago. Not as a plan exactly, more as an instinct. When humanity made first contact with the Eero Collective and understood, for the first time, that they were not alone in the universe, the initial response had been the one that made the history books: wonder, excitement, a great expansion of perspective. Those feelings were real. They lasted about 3 years. Then the people who spent their time thinking about worst-case scenarios got quiet and serious, and started working. The argument was simple. Humanity had spent its entire history in conflict with itself. Thousands of years of wars, large and small. Every civilization, every empire, every union had been built in the shadow of the possibility that something else might try to destroy it. That instinct did not go away just because the something else was now alien instead of human. If anything, it got sharper. At least when humans had fought each other, they had known the enemy, known the rules, known the weapons. Out here, they knew nothing. So they prepared, quietly, carefully, under a strategy that was never given an official name but was referred to informally by the people who built it as the duck doctrine, calm on the surface, busy underneath. The first thing they built was redundancy in their construction capacity. Asteroid mining operations that reported standard yields to the conclave but operated secondary shifts. The secondary shift's output went into a separate supply chain that the conclave registration system never saw. The material went to deep space coordinates that were never filed. Over decades, stations grew at those coordinates: shipyards, manufacturing plants, weapons testing facilities, research platforms for drive systems that went well beyond standard FTL. The ships were next. Earth's registered fleet, the one the conclave knew about, was modest. 47 warships, mostly older models, capable enough for basic defense. Nothing that would alarm anyone. It was exactly the kind of fleet a small, developing species should have. It was also not the only fleet humanity had. The second fleet had taken 40 years to build. It was distributed across 17 hidden deep space installations, never grouped in one place, never moving in visible patterns. 1,200 warships of designs that had never appeared in any conclave database, built from composite materials that absorbed most standard scan frequencies. Equipped with drive systems that could achieve FTL speeds 40% faster than anything currently registered with the conclave, and short-range sprint systems that had no equivalent in any known military. The weapons were different too, not more powerful necessarily, more precise. Humanity had spent a lot of time, more time than most species spent on such things, figuring out how to hit exactly what they were aiming at and nothing else, partly because their tactical doctrine valued precision, partly because they had learned from their own history that weapons that were too powerful in the wrong hands tended to come back around. The safest weapon was one that hit only what it was pointed at. Then there were the systems that weren't ships at all. 11,000 automated defense platforms spread through the outer solar system and beyond, each one disguised as survey satellites, weather monitors, communication relays, research buoys. They were networked to an AI warfare management system that could coordinate simultaneous fire from any combination of them in response to a threat profile. The system could do this without human input in under 3 seconds. With human input, it was faster. And there was more. The research division had been busy. Drive systems that could open a transit point anywhere in a star system without a fixed jump gate, a technology no other species in the conclave had. Long-range sensor suites that could detect ship movement at distances that the Vreth would consider physically impossible. Communication encryption that was, as far as anyone could determine, genuinely unbreakable with current galactic technology. And sitting in secure vaults in 3 separate locations were weapons that had been developed and tested and then locked away. Locked away not because they didn't work, because they worked too well, because the people who built them had decided, after a lot of long and difficult conversations, that some capabilities were better kept as last resorts, things you never wanted to actually use but needed to have, because the universe was a strange and unpredictable place. The engineers finished the briefing. The room was quiet for a while. One of the council members, Admiral Yuki Tanaka, was the first to speak. She was a small woman with very short hair and reading glasses. She pushed up her nose when she was thinking. When the Vreth Armada enters the Reach system, she said, what are they going to find? Nothing, Mace said, at first. And then? Mace looked at the system map on the wall. Reach Station, a star system on the outer edge of human colonial space. Quiet, apparently empty. At last count, 1,200 warships sitting dark and cold in carefully calculated positions throughout the outer asteroid belt and the shadow zones of the system's gas giant. Then, he said, they're going to find out what a mistake looks like from the inside. Tanaka looked at the map for a moment, Then she picked up her coffee and drank. "I almost feel sorry for them," she said. "Don't," Mace said. "They had a warning." She nodded slowly. "They did." Outside the building, Geneva was gray and cold, a thin rain falling on streets that had been walked by humans for a very long time, a city that had watched wars begin and end, a city that knew, better than most, what the quiet before something large felt like. The quiet was there now, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it, but Mace felt it every time he stepped outside. That particular stillness that came when something that had been building for a long time was almost ready. Almost. 22 days remained on the Conclave's 30-day countdown. Nobody from Earth had responded to it. Nobody was going to. The Vreth First Armada was a sight that had ended wars before they started. 4,000 warships. That was not a fleet. That was a statement. The Vreth had assembled it at their primary staging point in the Doran system over the course of 11 days, and by the time it was fully gathered, the heat signatures of its engines were visible to passive sensors 2 star systems away. It was not assembled quietly because the Vreth did not believe in being quiet. Quiet was for species that were afraid. The Vreth were not afraid. High Admiral Cross commanded the First Armada. He was a career military officer who had served in 2 of the Vreth Dominion's wars and had earned his rank by being the kind of commander who got results. He was methodical, aggressive in the right moments, and he had a gift for reading an engagement before it started. He had been told this would not be an engagement. This would be a demonstration. A fleet of this size arriving in human colonial space would trigger immediate compliance. The humans would see the numbers, calculate the impossibility of resistance, and stand down. The colonies would be surrendered. Earth would be reminded of its place. His own intelligence briefers had said, "Expect no combat." He expected no combat. The jump into the Reach system was clean. 4,000 ships dropping out of FTL in coordinated sequence, spreading into a standard approach formation. The system resolved on his bridge displays a mid-sized star, 4 planets, an asteroid belt, a distant gas giant. Reach Station was in the inner system, orbiting the 3rd planet. Cross looked at his scanner station. "Give me the threat picture." The scanner officer worked her board for a moment. "Station appears to be at minimal power. I'm reading no active defenses. Ship count in the system." She paused. "I'm reading 2 ships, both small class, possibly support vessels." 2 ships. For a moment Cross felt something that wasn't quite disappointment and wasn't quite relief. Mostly, it was the flatness of a man who had prepared for a fight and found an empty room. "They ran," his operations officer said. "Apparently," Cross said. He opened a ship-wide address. "All units approach formation. We will hold short of the station and issue a surrender protocol to any remaining human personnel." He closed the channel. "Get me a full scan of the system. Everything. I want to know if there are any ships hiding behind the gas giant before we—" "Admiral." He turned. The scanner officer's voice had changed. Something in it that he did not immediately recognize. It took him a second, and then he did recognize it, and his stomach dropped slightly. It was fear. "Admiral," she said again, "the asteroids." He looked at the main display. The asteroid belt stretched across the middle region of the system in a broad band, thousands of rocks in various sizes, perfectly ordinary. He had glanced at it when they dropped in and dismissed it, the way you dismissed any asteroid belt. Background scenery. Now the scanner was adding heat signatures to the display. And the heat signatures were coming from the asteroids. Not from behind the asteroids, not near the asteroids. From the asteroids. Not all of them, not most of them, but among the thousands of real rocks spread throughout the belt in positions that blended perfectly with the genuine debris around them, the heat signatures of ships were appearing. They had been cold, completely cold. No power output, no engine signature, no electronic emissions of any kind for what must have been The scanner officer's calculation appeared on screen: 11 days. 11 days of sitting dead cold in space, running on passive systems, hidden not by technology but by sheer patience. The number was still climbing as the system resolved the contacts. "I'm counting." The scanner officer's voice was careful and deliberate. The voice of someone who was very focused on not letting what they were feeling come through. 400, 600, 800. "How many?" Cross said. His voice was level, he was a professional. 1,214 confirmed contacts, Admiral, human-class vessels. Configuration is unlike anything in our database. A pause. "They are activating." The display showed it in real time. 1,214 ships coming to life simultaneously across a 400,000-kilometer spread. Not charging weapons, not moving yet, just waking up. Lights coming on in the dark. Systems powering up in sequence, steady and calm, the way you'd turn on the lights in a building at the start of a working day. There was something about the calmness of it that was worse than if they had come in firing. Something about the total absence of hurry in the way those ships powered up that said clearly and plainly, "We have been waiting for you, and we are not surprised to see you." A transmission came in. Universal frequency. Human vocal patterns running through the translation system. The voice was a woman's. She sounded like she was reading something she had prepared. "Vreth First Armada, this is Captain Lena Holt of the EFS Resolute commanding the Reach Defense Group. You have entered a human-designated defense zone. Your fleet will come to a full stop. You will not advance further into this system. If you comply, no action will be taken. If you do not comply, we will disable your fleet." A short pause and then, with no change in tone, "Take a moment to think carefully." Cross stared at the display. 4,000 ships versus 1,200. The math was still in his favor by a significant margin. His ships were larger on average. His firepower was substantial. But something had changed in the last 60 seconds. Something that he had not been briefed on and had not accounted for. He turned to his operations officer. "Analysis." The operations officer was already working. "Their spread is tactical. They've got firing lines on our approach corridor and both flanking vectors. Their formation doesn't concentrate them, they're distributed. Hitting them all at once is," a pause, "complicated." "Their ship design, what are we looking at?" "I don't know," the operations officer said. "I genuinely don't know. The hull composition is absorbing most of our active scan. I can't get interior data. I can't get weapon hardpoint readings. I can't get drive specifications." Cross sat with that for a moment. His intelligence people had told him Earth's fleet was 47 outdated warships. He was looking at 1,200 vessels of unknown capability. The difference between those two numbers was not a rounding error. It was not a reporting mistake. It was a lie of such enormous scale that it had apparently fooled the entire galactic intelligence community for decades. "Admiral," his communications officer said, "High Consul Draven is requesting a status update." Cross looked at the display for another few seconds. Then he made the decision that he had been trained to make when faced with incomplete information and an uncertain threat picture. He made the wrong one, not because he was a bad commander, because he was a proud one, and because nothing in his experience had prepared him for the idea that humanity, the species that had been sitting in the back row of the conclave for 60 years, might actually have to be taken seriously. "All units advance," he said. "Combat formation." The battle that followed lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes. Commander Davik was 19 years into his career in the Vreth fleet. He had served on 3 different ships and seen 2 combat engagements before this one. He was a weapons officer on the destroyer Vethkor, a mid-size vessel positioned in the third line of the Armada's advance formation. He had good instincts, and he trusted them. Right now, his instincts were sending him a message that he was finding difficult to process. From his station, he watched the opening of the engagement. The human ships moved, not toward the Armada. That was the first thing. They didn't charge, they spread. They broke their formation outward in multiple directions simultaneously, moving with speed that his drive analysis showed was significantly beyond standard FTL sprint capability, and they went to positions that made no immediate tactical sense. Until, about 40 seconds later, when the first Vreth units in the forward formation began to experience weapons fire. And Davik looked at the tactical map and saw that the human ships had placed themselves in firing positions that covered the forward formation from 6 separate vectors at once. There was no blind spot anywhere in the forward formation. No matter which direction a Vreth ship tried to turn, human fire could reach it from an angle that made its shields less effective. The weapons themselves were strange. They were not the energy weapons that most major powers used. They were more targeted, more precise. The first volley from human ships struck the forward formation's lead vessels, and the results were not explosions. The Vreth ships went dark, systems failed, engines cut out. The hulls were intact. The ships were simply stopped, like something had reached inside each one and switched off the relevant systems with a careful hand. Davik heard his bridge crew reporting the contacts going dark. He ran his own analysis. The targeting pattern was extraordinary. Whatever weapons the humans were using, they were hitting specific system nodes on each ship, specific points that took the vessel offline without destroying it. The precision required to do that, at combat range, with ships moving at their current velocities, was not something Davik had believed was possible. The second wave came for the middle formation. The Veth core shuddered. A direct impact. Davik's board lit up with system failures. Engines were down. Weapons were offline. Life support was fine. The hull was intact. He was not dead. He was simply stopped, sitting dead in space, while around him, ship by ship, the armada went quiet. He sat at his station for a long moment, looking at a display that was running on emergency power, showing him a battle that was not going the way any Vreth officer in the history of the Dominion had ever imagined a battle going. 1,200 human ships, 4,000 Vreth ships, the numbers had not mattered. From the observation drone's perspective, the battle looked different. The Galactic Conclave maintained a network of autonomous observation drones throughout member species territories. They were designed to record events of diplomatic significance, military engagements, territorial disputes, notable political events. They broadcast on an open channel that any conclave member could access. They were rarely watched live. Usually the footage was reviewed after the fact, for records purposes. Today, someone in the Keth Media Network noticed the drone in the Reach system had gone active. They put the feed on their broadcast. Within 2 hours, 40 million people across a dozen species were watching the Battle of Reach Station live. What they watched was difficult to describe, because it didn't look like what war was supposed to look like. War in most of the galaxy's recent memory looked like two forces meeting in a blaze of fire and destruction. Ships exploding, hulls breaching, the terrible beauty of weapons at scale. This looked like something being carefully dismantled. The human ships moved through the Vreth armada with a precision that seemed almost slow at first, until you looked more carefully and realized they were slow because they were being careful. Every weapon discharge was deliberate. Every ship they engaged was taken offline, not destroyed. They moved through the formation like people who knew exactly where everything was and exactly what they needed to touch to stop it, and they touched only that and nothing else. By the third hour, the drone's feed was showing a field of 4,000 disabled Vreth warships drifting quietly in the Reach system, while human vessels moved among them like workers walking through a finished building, doing final checks. The Vreth flagship, the Dominion's Will, a capital ship 7 kilometers long that was the largest vessel in the Vreth military, went dark in the 4th hour. Not dramatically. Its systems simply failed, one by one, in a sequence that took about 40 seconds, and then it was still. 20 minutes later, the human transmission went out. It was broadcast on every open frequency in the system, and the observation drone picked it up and relayed it instantly to the 40 million people who were still watching. Vreth First Armada personnel will be treated under full humanitarian protocols. Medical teams will be available for any crew requiring assistance. Vreth command staff may contact EFS Resolute for arrangement of safe communication with the Dominion. A pause. Send your second Armada if you need a second lesson. Earth Command. The feed cut to a view of the Reach system. 4,000 Vreth ships sitting dark. 1,200 human vessels in neat formation around them like a fence, lights on, engines running. In living spaces and fleet command centers and diplomatic offices across 40 member species, 40 million people sat with that image and said nothing. Captain Lena Holt stood on the bridge of the Resolute and looked at the tactical display. She was 40 years old, solidly built, with the particular quality of stillness that long years in the void of space tended to produce in people. She had been running on 6 hours of sleep in the last 2 days, and she had 3 empty coffee cups on the console next to her station. She was not celebrating. None of her crew was celebrating. That was a thing that movies showed soldiers doing after battles and reality generally did not. What her crew was doing was running system checks, filing position reports, coordinating with the medical teams, updating the disabled vessel log, and communicating with the fleet-wide network in quiet, professional voices. Her first officer, a man named Carver with a mechanical left arm he'd had since an unrelated accident years ago, came to stand beside her. He looked at the display for a moment. Final count is 3,842 disabled. 112 chose to attempt retreat and got disabled during the attempt. 62 managed to jump out before we could close the net. Any destroyed? No. She nodded slowly. That had been the standing order from Geneva. No destroyed vessels. 0. Every Vreth ship that could be disabled was to be disabled. No exceptions. It was not a soft order. It was a tactical order. The purpose of this engagement was not to kill Vreth sailors. The purpose was to demonstrate something. Something that a pile of wreckage could not demonstrate half as well as 4,000 intact, silent, helpless warships floating in a star system they had arrived in expecting to be in charge of. Casualties on our side, she asked. 14 minor injuries across the group, Carver said. 11 from system strain, 3 from debris contact during the first phase. No serious injuries, no deaths. Lena looked at the display for another moment. Then she turned and walked to the observation window at the back of the bridge. Through it she could see open space, and in the middle distance, the drifting shapes of disabled warships, dark against the stars. She thought about the war rooms on those ships, the officers sitting in powered-down bridges in the dark. She thought about what that felt like, and she was honest with herself about it. She felt some sympathy. They had been sent into something they hadn't been told the truth about. That wasn't entirely their fault. She turned back to her crew. "Start the prisoner communication protocols," she said, "and get me Geneva." The display lit up, the secure link establishing through multiple relays. Mace's face appeared on the screen. He looked at the tactical readout behind her for a moment. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. He was quiet for a second. "Clean." "As clean as it gets," she said. He nodded. The ghost of something passed across his face, not quite relief, not quite satisfaction. Something more complicated. The expression of a man who had worked for 30 years to make sure something happened a certain way and was now looking at evidence that it had. "Good work, Captain," he said. She nodded back. "What's next?" He looked off-screen for a moment at whatever displays he was watching in Geneva. "The conclave is in emergency session," he said. 41 species requesting our response to the resolution. The Vreth are not going to take this quietly." He paused. "And 3 other powers are having conversations they don't think we know about." "But we know about them," she said. "We know about them," he confirmed. She looked back out the observation window one more time. 4,000 ships, every one of them intact, every one of them silent. "They'll form a coalition," she said. Yasme said, "They will." And then he picked up his coffee mug. He finally drank from it. "And then we give them the same warning we gave the Vreth," he said, "and we wait to see if they're smarter about it." Lena turned away from the window. Around her, the crew of the Resolute worked steadily, quietly, professionally. Outside, the stars were very bright and the Vreth Armada floated in silence. The galaxy was watching, 40 million people and counting, and by morning it would be more. By the end of the week, it would be every connected screen in the conclave. They had all just watched humanity fight. Now they understood what that meant. There is a particular kind of meeting that happens in private, between people who believe they have not yet been caught. It has a specific feel to it. Voices kept low, doors secured, statements made indirectly at first and then more directly as the meeting goes on, and the participants grow more comfortable with what they are agreeing to. These meetings have happened many times in human history. They have also happened many times in the history of every other species that has ever built an empire. Power finds its own level, and when something threatens the level, the powers talk. The 4 conversations happened on the same day. Different star systems, different species, different rooms, but the same essential conversation. The Vreth Dominion had lost 4,000 ships at Reach Station, not destroyed, disabled, which was, in some ways, worse. Destruction would have been a catastrophe, but catastrophes could be mourned and recovered from. Disability was something else. It meant that somewhere in a human-controlled star system, 4,000 Vreth warships were sitting intact and operational, just not by Vreth hands. It meant High Consul Draven had to explain to his council and his public and his military that not one ship of the First Armada had been sunk, which should have been comforting, but was in fact the most profoundly humiliating detail of the entire event, because the implication was clear. The humans could have sunk them and chose not to. The humans had been kind about it. That was unbearable. The Surak hegemony controlled 22 star systems in a dense cluster in the galactic arm adjacent to Vreth space. They were an older civilization, not ancient, but old enough to have been around when the Conclave was founded and to have had a permanent seat on its Security Council for 300 years. They were not prone to panic. They were prone to calculation. And their calculations, in the 72 hours following the Battle of Reach Station, had produced a result they did not like. The myriad clans of those were a loose confederation of 9 different subspecies that had, through a long and complicated history, ended up sharing a home system, and eventually 3 others. Their military was large because their political structure required them to maintain fleets for internal as much as external purposes. They were pragmatic. They believed in dealing with problems before problems dealt with them. The Paradin Empire was the smallest of the 4 in terms of star systems, but the most technologically developed of the 3 non-Vreth parties. They had been the first species in this region of the galaxy to develop FTL travel over 800 years ago. They were proud of that in a way that had survived 800 years of other species catching up and passing them in various areas. They still considered themselves the galaxy's senior technological civilization. The events at Reach Station had made them deeply uncomfortable for reasons that were personal as much as political. The 4 parties came together formally 17 days after the Battle of Reach Station. The meeting was held in a neutral system, aboard a station that belonged to a minor species who had been offered certain political favors in exchange for the use of their facility and their silence. The conclave was not officially informed. No press was present. They called what they formed the Galactic Stabilization Coalition. The name had been chosen carefully. Every word was doing work. Galactic suggested broad mandate and collective responsibility. Stabilization implied they were responding to a threat rather than creating one. Coalition was softer than alliance and had fewer formal treaty implications. It was a good name. It meant whatever a listener wanted it to mean, while meaning something very specific to the people who had chosen it. The specific meaning was, we are going to deal with humanity before humanity becomes something we can no longer deal with. Their combined fleet was extraordinary. 42,000 warships at last registry. Between the four powers, they controlled over 100 star systems. Their combined economic output was roughly 30% of the total conclave economy. They were, by any reasonable standard, a force that had ended civilizations before and could credibly end one again. They prepared their ultimatum with considerable care. It was stern but not vicious. It laid out specific demands: the surrender of all human military assets, the dismantling of all unregistered facilities, the acceptance of coalition oversight of Earth's remaining territories, and the reclassification of humanity as a protected species under joint coalition management. It gave Earth 72 hours to respond with a formal commitment to compliance. It stated, without excessive detail, that noncompliance would result in the full application of the coalition's combined military power. It was, as ultimatums go, thorough. The coalition's joint envoy was a Surak diplomat named Peter Sci. He was experienced, composed, and had delivered difficult messages before. He arrived at Conclave Station with a delegation of 12 and requested a private meeting with the Earth delegation. The meeting was granted. The room they were given was a standard diplomatic meeting space. A long table, chairs adjusted for various species, water and nutrient dispensers along one wall, no windows. Neutral, functional, slightly impersonal. It was the kind of room where you signed things and made agreements, not the kind of room where anything surprising happened. Peter Sci arrived with his delegation and found two humans already waiting. Delegate Serena Voss sat on one side of the table. She looked exactly as she had looked at the conclave session 3 weeks earlier, still, attentive, dressed in her blue diplomatic uniform with the small golden pin. She had a glass of water she would probably not drink. Beside her sat General Haruto Mace. He was in his service uniform, gray and undecorated except for his rank insignia. He was looking at the table in front of him with the expression of a man who was thinking about something else entirely. Sci settled into his chair and his delegation arranged themselves around him. He studied the two humans for a moment. He had read their files. He knew their records. He had prepared for this meeting extensively. He had expected to feel the comfortable imbalance of power, the sense you got when you walked into a room with the winning hand. He had experienced that feeling many times in his career. He did not feel it now. He could not immediately explain why. The room was the same room it always was. The humans across from him were the same two people they had been in their files. Nothing about the situation had materially changed from how he had briefed himself. But there was something in the way they sat, not aggressive, not fearful, not trying to project anything in particular, that made him feel, without being able to articulate it precisely, that he had arrived prepared for the wrong conversation. He presented the ultimatum. He took his time. He was thorough. He covered all the points, delivered with appropriate gravity, maintaining the tone of a reasonable person offering a reasonable solution to a difficult situation. He finished and placed the formal document on the table. Mace hadn't moved during the presentation. He'd listened with his eyes on the middle distance, not looking at Sci but not ignoring him either. When Sci finished, Mace looked at the document on the table and then at Sci. "Is that everything?" he asked. "That is the full coalition position," Sci said. Mace nodded once. He looked at Serena. Serena reached into her bag and produced a single data chip. She set it on the table between them. "This is Earth's full military manifest," she said. "I'm going to ask you to read it, all of it. Take as much time as you need." Sci looked at the chip. He looked at her. In his long career, he had seen various versions of this move, the dramatic reveal, the document produced at a critical moment for psychological effect. He had learned to be skeptical of theater. He picked up the chip and inserted it into the table reader. He started reading. The document was long. It had sections. The first section covered Earth's registered military assets, the 47 ships the Conclave knew about. He moved past that quickly. The second section was titled Class 2 Assets, and it was where his reading speed began to slow. By the third section, he had stopped moving entirely. He was still. His delegation members, who were reading the same display on their secondary screens, had gone similarly quiet. The document covered everything: the hidden fleet, the weapons platforms, the AI defense networks, the advanced drive systems, the sensor array, the classified research projects. Each item was listed with specifications, coordinates, current operational status, and production capacity. It was not a summary document. It was a complete and verified ledger, the kind produced not for show but for the use of the people who actually managed the systems described in it. Salas read for 22 minutes. His delegation read for 22 minutes. No one at the coalition side of the table spoke. When he finished, he sat back from the display. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the table. Then he looked up at Serena. "This is verified," he said. His voice was very level, a diplomat's voice. "Every entry," she said. "You're welcome to confirm any specific asset you'd like to verify." He was quiet again. "These last 3 sections," he said, "the research vaults." "Yes," she said. "You haven't deployed those." "No," she said. "Why not?" She held his gaze steadily. "Because we don't want to," she said simply. "We have never wanted to. We built all of this hopping we would never need it. We would very much prefer to continue hopping that." Salas was quiet for a while. In the silence, Mace reached forward and picked up the coalition's ultimatum document. He looked at it for a moment, reading it again. Then he set it back down on the table. "General," Salas said. Mace looked up. "What is your response to the coalition's terms?" Mace reached into his own briefing folder and produced a single sheet, printed on real paper, which was an unusual choice. He placed it on the table. "Those are our terms," he said. "The coalition disbands within 72 hours. All ships return to home territory. No further political action against Earth or its colonies is taken. We will consider this matter settled." He paused. "That is our only offer." Salas looked at the paper. Then he looked at the data chip still sitting in the table reader. Then he looked at the 2 humans across from him. He was a man who had spent 40 years in diplomacy. He had built his career on the ability to read situations accurately. He looked at Serena Voss, and he understood that she was not afraid of him. Not personally, not politically, not militarily. She was completely at peace with the situation, the way a person is at peace when they know exactly where they stand and they are satisfied with where that is. And he understood that her peace was not built on arrogance or miscalculation. It was built on 80 years of very quiet, very patient preparation. He picked up the paper. He folded it carefully and put it in his pocket. Then he collected the data chip and placed it back in front of Serena. "I will relay your response to the coalition," he said. 72 hours, she said. "After that, the conversation is different." He rose. His delegation rose around him. He paused at the door. He was a professional, and he would not let what he was feeling show in his face. But he was also an honest man in his own way, and what he was feeling was something he thought needed to be said. "Delegate Voss," he said. She looked at him. "At the conclave session," he said, "when you said we wouldn't want you to stop holding back," he paused. "I was among those who thought it was theater." "I know," she said. He nodded once, then he left. The room was quiet. Mace picked up his coffee, which had been sitting cold since before the coalition delegation arrived, and drank it anyway. "2 of them will stand down," Serena said. "Those and Paradin," he agreed, "within 36 hours. Vreth and Surek will not." "No," he said, "they won't." She looked at the table for a moment. "Then it continues." Then it continues, he said. Outside the meeting room in the long corridors of Conclave Station, Praetor Salis walked at a steady pace back to his delegation's transit bay. His 12 delegates walked around him. Nobody spoke. They had all read the manifest. They were all doing the same calculation. His own calculation had completed somewhere around page 18 of the third section. The result was clear and uncomfortable and impossible to argue with. He would relay Earth's terms to the coalition. He would recommend, in very clear language, that the myriad clans and the Paradin Empire accept those terms. He would tell them that he had been in the room, that he had read the document, and that the number 42,000 was not the number they thought it was. He did not know if he would be believed. He did not know if the Vreth and the Surak would listen. He knew that in 72 hours, they were going to find out together. In the observation lounges of Conclave Station, journalists from a dozen species were watching the movement of delegations in the corridors with the attentive focus of people who knew something important was happening even if they didn't yet know what. Ve Oren of the Keth Republic watched Praetor Salis walk past the lounge window and made a note. The senior Surak diplomat looked like a man who had just read something that had changed his view of the situation considerably. She pulled up her sources and started making calls. The 72-hour clock was running. And in deep space, in 17 hidden installations spread across the outer system and beyond, 1,200 human warships sat with their engines warm, their crews at station, and their orders open on every terminal. Waiting the way they had been waiting for a very long time. Patiently, completely, without a trace of doubt, the 72 hours passed. In that time, two things happened that Mace and Serena had expected, and one thing that neither of them had fully anticipated. The first expected thing. The myriad clans of those formally withdrew from the coalition on hour 31. They released a brief public statement that said, in diplomatic terms so careful they barely said anything at all, that the coalition's objectives were no longer aligned with the clan's strategic interests, and that the clans wished all parties a successful resolution to the current difficulties. What the statement did not say, but what everyone who understood how these things worked understood, was that someone from those had read the manifest or been told what was in it, and decided very quickly that this was a fight they did not want to be in. The second expected thing, the Paradin Empire followed at hour 44. Their statement was even shorter, one paragraph, formal withdrawal and best wishes. Their representative at Conclave Station booked transit home within the hour. 2 down, 2 remaining. The unexpected thing was what the Vreth did in hour 51. High Consul Dravin went public. He released a full broadcast on every major Conclave media channel, not just Vreth channels, all of them. And he delivered a speech that was passionate and angry, and in places, genuinely moving in the way that speeches by proud people about to make terrible decisions can sometimes be. He talked about the dignity of the galactic order. He talked about the danger of an unchecked species building weapons in secret for 80 years. He talked about the responsibility of established powers to maintain stability. He talked about humanity as a threat that the galaxy had been too polite to name directly. It was a good speech. Parts of it were even fair, in a narrow sense. The parts about secret military buildup were not wrong on their face. What the speech also did was announce publicly that the Vreth Dominion and the Surak hegemony were committing their full joint fleet to a correction of what Dravin called the human problem. Combined, their forces numbered over 28,000 warships. He gave no timeline. He gave no specific targets. He gave the impression of a coalition that still had momentum, even after losing 2 members. He gave the impression of certainty. The broadcast reached 40 million viewers in the first hour, and 200 million by the following morning. Serena watched it from her quarters on Conclave Station. She sat on the edge of her bed with a cup of tea that was going cold, watching the display. When the broadcast finished, she sat for a moment in the quiet of the room. Then she opened her communicator and called Mace. "I saw it," he said before she could speak. "He's trying to build public pressure," she said. "Yes. It won't work if we move before it builds enough." "No," he said, "it won't." There was a pause. She looked at her tea. "Are we ready?" "We've been ready," he said. "The question is whether you want to give them any more time." She thought about that. She was an honest person and she thought about it seriously, the way she tried to think about every decision that had weight to it. She thought about the Vreth sailors at Reach Station who had been treated well, fed, communicated with, and eventually returned to Dominion space without harm. She thought about the Surak fleet that had done nothing yet except exist. She thought about all the other species in the conclave who were watching, and what they would see, and what she wanted them to see. She thought about what Draven's speech was doing hour by hour across 200 million screens, building fear, building pressure, building a story in which humanity was the danger, the secret threat, the thing that needed to be managed. Every hour the story had to keep building was an hour it got more traction. "No more time," she said. "Agreed," Mace said. "The operation starts in 4 hours." She nodded and closed the call. She sat with her cold tea for another moment. Then she put it down, straightened her uniform, and went to work. Operation Open Hand had taken 3 years to plan and 8 months to position. It was named deliberately for the idea of an open hand extended, not a fist. It was designed from the first line of its operational document to be an act of demonstration, not destruction. Every objective in the plan was a military target: shipyards, weapons platforms, command relay stations, fuel and material depots. Not one civilian installation was included on the target list. The order was clear and specific and had been reviewed by a civilian ethics board before approval. Nothing that serves a civilian population, nothing that causes secondary civilian impact, nothing that cannot be rebuilt. Take the weapons away. Leave the people. It ran across 14 star systems simultaneously. The human fleet divided into groups before the operation began, each group prepositioned at their assigned systems, waiting for the single coordinated signal that would start the clock. The signal went out at 300 Geneva Standard Time, a time chosen because it had no particular significance. They had decided against ceremony. What followed over the next 9 hours was something that the galaxy had never seen and would spend a long time processing. In each of the 14 systems, human forces arrived at their targets and moved with a speed and precision that made the Battle of Reach Station look unhurried. The Vreth had 3 major shipyard complexes, facilities where warships were constructed and maintained, each one capable of producing dozens of vessels a year. The human forces hit all 3 in the first 40 minutes. Not destroyed, disabled. The construction equipment, the manufacturing systems, the launch infrastructure, all of it stopped. The workers had been given 30 minutes of advance notice via a direct signal to each facility, long enough to clear the work floors. By the time human forces arrived, the facilities were empty of personnel and full of very expensive, very non-functional equipment. The Surak had a chain of weapons platforms that stretched across 3 star systems, a network they called the Hegemony Shield. It had taken them 60 years to build, and they were proud of it. Human forces worked through it systematically, like someone walking down a street turning off each streetlight in sequence. Platform by platform, from one end of the chain to the other over a period of 4 hours. Each one went dark cleanly. No debris. No residual hazard to navigation. Command relay stations, fuel depots, military communication hubs, construction material stockpiles. Each target on the list was handled the same way. Efficient, clean, no escalation, no collateral, no deaths. A team arrived, did what it came to do, and moved to the next target. 9 hours and 11 minutes after the operation began, the last target was cleared and the signal went back to Geneva. Complete. Mace read the completion report in the War Council room. The 12 people around the table read it at the same time he did. When everyone had finished, the room was quiet for a while. "Casualties?" one of the council members asked. Director Chen looked at her pad. 3 injuries across the entire operation. 2 from equipment malfunction unrelated to enemy contact. 1 from a minor weapons discharge that caused no serious harm. She paused. The Vreth and Surak combined lost no personnel. There are 17 Vreth and 23 Surak military personnel currently aboard human medical ships receiving treatment for various pre-existing conditions or minor issues they experienced during the operation. We're treating them and will return them when we return the disabled ships. The council member stared at her. "We're treating their sick." "We found a Vreth crewman on one of the shipyard platforms who had a cardiac event when we arrived," Chen said. "Our medics stabilized him. He's fine." A moment of quiet around the table. Then Admiral Tanaka, who had been in the room for all of it, said simply, "Good." And that was all she said, and it was all that needed saying. Mace closed the completion report. He sat for a moment. Then he stood up, told the room to carry on, and walked out. He went up to the surface of the building and stood outside in the Geneva air. It was morning, early, the sun barely up. The city was beginning to move around him. People going to work. Delivery vehicles, transit systems, the smell of coffee from somewhere nearby. A perfectly ordinary Geneva morning. He stood there for a while. He was 61 years old and he had spent 30 years of his life planning for something that had just happened and was now over. He did not know exactly what he was supposed to feel. Tired, mostly. Satisfied in a quiet way. Slightly awed, if he was honest, at the straightforward fact that it had worked, that the plan, at every stage, had held together the way it was supposed to. He thought about all the people who had built this. Engineers who had spent careers on facilities that didn't officially exist. Sailors who had served on ships that couldn't come home to port, living rotation after rotation in deep space so that the secret held. Scientists who had done their best work in classified labs with no professional credit for any of it. People who had believed, without proof, that the preparation mattered, that the galaxy was worth preparing for. They had been right. He went back inside. The emergency conclave session was called within hours of the operation's completion. This time, the chamber was not at capacity. It was overfull. Species who didn't normally send delegates had sent them. Senior representatives who usually let junior staff handle routine sessions had come themselves. The gallery levels were packed. The press section was overflowing. High Consul Draven entered the chamber and walked to the Vreth delegation table. He looked different than he had 3 weeks earlier. He was the same person, same size, same armor, same deliberate walk. But something was different in the way he moved. The particular kind of confidence he'd always carried, the confidence that came from having the biggest fleet in any room, was absent. He sat down and looked at the displays showing the operation's after-action data, which had been submitted by Earth to the Conclave record as required by military engagement protocol. He read the data for a long time. No civilian targets, no deaths. The shipyards were disabled but structurally intact and fully repairable. The weapons platforms were offline but undamaged. Every piece of hardware was still there. Nobody had been killed. He sat with that. Presiding voice Amara called the session to order. The agenda was simple: response to Earth's military operation, determination of next steps, and resolution of the current political situation. Several species requested the floor immediately. The queue was longer than anything the chamber had processed in years. Mace and Serena sat at the human delegation table. Their position in the chamber was the same as always, near the back, the probationary member's spot. Serena had her datapad. Mace had, somehow, gotten coffee. The speeches went for 2 hours. They ranged from angry to frightened to carefully neutral to, in a few cases, barely concealed admiration. The Keth representative gave a long and detailed account of the operational data, and noted formally that in a 9-hour engagement across 14 star systems, not one non-military target had been touched. She did not say this as a compliment exactly. She said it as a matter of record. The record made an impression on the room. The Surak representative spoke. He was composed and careful. He said that the hegemony had suffered significant damage to its defense infrastructure and was formally filing a grievance. But he also said, which was notable, that the hegemony had reviewed the terms of the Vreth Dominion's original motion 3 weeks earlier and had several procedural concerns about whether that motion had followed proper conclave protocols. This was a very polished way of starting to distance themselves from the situation they were in. When it was Draven's turn, the chamber went very quiet. He stood at the central platform for a moment without speaking. He was looking at the operational data display which was still showing on the main board. 14 systems, 9 hours, 0 deaths. The Vreth Dominion, he said at last, has suffered military losses. He stopped. He seemed to be choosing his next words very carefully. I came to this chamber 3 weeks ago to secure a resolution that would place humanity in a position appropriate to its. He paused again. A longer pause, appropriate to its perceived capability. Another pause. The perception was incorrect. He said it flatly. No decoration. The Vreth High Consul before the full galactic conclave on a session being watched by hundreds of millions, saying plainly, we were wrong about what they were. He looked at the human delegation table. He looked at Serena and Mace for a moment with an expression that was difficult to name. Not hatred, not admiration. Something more honest than either of those, which was assessment, recalibration, the expression of a mind working through new information and arriving at new conclusions. I withdraw the motion of 32 days ago, he said, and I formally request that the conclave rescind all resolutions passed as a result of that motion. He sat down. The chamber was quiet for a long, full moment. Then several delegate indicators lit up at once. Formal motions. Rescinding the original resolution, restoring Earth's colony status, and from the Earl Collective, who had not spoken since the original session either, a motion to reclassify Earth as a Tier 1 sovereign power and offer humanity a permanent seat on the Conclave Security Council. The vote on rescinding the original resolution was unanimous. The vote on Tier 1 status passed with 193 in favor, 12 abstentions, and no votes against. Serena watched the numbers appear on the display board. She did not react visibly. Tomas, beside her, made a sound that was quietly and professionally suppressed. A third motion was filed, from 4 separate species simultaneously, requesting mutual defense treaty discussions with Earth. A fourth came in as the third was being processed. A fifth. By the end of the session, 11 separate species had filed formal requests to begin defense cooperation talks with humanity. Mace looked at Serena. Did you expect 11? I expected 8, she said. He said and drank his coffee. The session ended in late afternoon. The chamber cleared slowly, everyone talking, the air in the room carrying the charged quality of people who had just watched history happen and were still processing it. Serena stayed behind after most of the delegations had left. She stood at the wide observation window near the back of the main floor, looking out at the stars. She stood there quietly for a while. She heard footsteps and turned. The observer delegate was there, standing a few meters away, wrapped in dark fabric as always. You spoke again, Serena said. We did, the observer said in that dry old voice. We are making a habit of it apparently. A pause. We wanted to see how this ended. Is this how you expected it to end? She asked. The observer was quiet for a moment. We expected you to win, it said. We were less certain you would win the way you did. What do you mean? You could have destroyed things, the observer said. You had the capability, you chose not to. A pause. Many species, given what you had, would have chosen differently. Serena looked back out the window. "We know what destruction leads to," she said. "We've had a lot of practice learning." "Yes," the observer said, "you have." Another pause, and this time the pause had something in it, something that sounded from this ancient being that hadn't spoken for 400 years before last month, almost like respect. "That is why we spoke the first time. Not because you were strong, because of how you were strong." Serena didn't say anything. Outside, the stars were the same stars they had always been, unchanged by all of it, indifferent. The observer moved away quietly, and she was alone at the window. She stayed there a while longer. A young diplomat from the Czech Republic came to find her eventually, fresh-faced, clearly junior, the kind of person who rehearsed their questions before they asked them. She could tell he had been building up to this conversation for a few minutes. "Delegate Voss," he said, "can I ask you something?" She turned from the window. "You can ask." He hesitated. "When you delivered that warning at the first session, before any of this happened," he paused, "were you ever actually afraid?" Serena looked at him. He was young and sincere and had probably been assigned to cover the conclave 2 weeks ago and had no idea what he'd walked into. She thought about the question. She thought about 30 years of people building things in the dark and hoping they'd never be needed. She thought about Mace's face in the call after the conclave vote. She thought about Captain Holt at the window of the Resolute, looking out at 4,000 still ships. "Every single day," she said. "That's why we prepared." He looked at her for a moment, processing that. Then he nodded, wrote something in his pad, and thanked her. He moved away. She looked out the window one last time. Then she picked up her bag and walked out. In the weeks that followed, things changed. The conclave passed a resolution requiring all member species to file accurate military registrations, a direct result of what had happened, though no one said so explicitly. Several species, upon hearing this, quietly filed amended registrations of their own. They were not the only ones who had been busy in the dark. Earth's outer colonies were returned to full human administration. Reach Station, which had spent 11 days as the hiding place of 1,200 warships, went back to being a functioning colonial outpost. The residents there, who had been evacuated and then been told what their station had been used for, mostly reacted with a mixture of pride and the particular humor of people who find out they've been living next to something extraordinary without knowing it. A bar near the docking level put a new sign up. It said, "We were here first." Mace retired 7 weeks after Operation Open Hand. His farewell address was brief. He delivered it to the War Council room, not publicly. He said what he wanted to say to the people who had actually done the work, not to a broadcast. "Every soldier we trained hoped they'd never be needed," he said. "The greatest victory isn't the war you win, it's the one everyone else decides not to start." He looked around the room. "Thank you, all of you." He went home. He had a house in Kyushu he hadn't spent enough time in. He had a garden that needed attention. He had a grandson who was 2 years old and had no idea what his grandfather had spent his life doing. Mace decided that was fine. The work had been done so that the boy would grow up in a galaxy that knew what humanity was. That was enough. The classified programs began, slowly and carefully, to wind down. Not all of them. The galaxy was still the galaxy, full of things that weren't entirely known, full of the possibility that something new and difficult would one day appear on the horizon. You didn't dismantle your capability because one situation had resolved well. That was how you ended up unprepared. But some of them, scaled back, rotated to reserve. Some of the installations that had run continuously for 40 years went a standby mode for the first time. Some of the sailors who had spent years on hidden ships got to come home. Somewhere in the deep dark of the outer solar system, in installations that still appeared on no official map, lights that had burned for decades dimmed slightly. Not off, just dimmer, just enough. A galaxy that had laughed 3 weeks ago now knew better. A species that had sat in the back row for 60 years now, had a seat at the table where decisions were made. And in a quiet office on Conclave Station, with a view of stars that stretched in every direction for distances that were almost impossible to truly comprehend, Delegate Serena Voss sat down at her desk, opened her datapad, and got back to work. There was, as always, a great deal to do.